Trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us as a result of what happened to us. Gabor Maté. Have you ever had the feeling of being stuck in time, even as everything around you keeps moving? No matter how many goals you achieve, how many changes you try to make, how many new phases of life begin, something in you seems to still live in an old place, as if part of your soul was left behind, trapped in a pain that was never spoken, in a silence that was never heard. This is the most subtle prison, living in the present with your body, but remaining in the past with your psyche. And it manifests in ways that many don't even recognize as symptoms: difficulty trusting, exaggerated reactions to small situations, a chronic sadness without a clear cause, the feeling of always reacting and never truly choosing. Sometimes the prison comes in the form of rumination, the mind reliving old scenes, reenacting dialogues, imagining alternative versions of what cannot be undone. Other times it appears as an absence. You don't remember, but you feel. You can't name it, but you carry it. And therein lies the paradox. It is not what happened that traps us, but what remained frozen inside us because of what happened. As Gabor Maté says, trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us as a result of what happened to us. Pain, when unprocessed, doesn't become the past. It becomes a system, an internal system of defense, of closure, of protection. A system that begins with the intention of survival, but over time transforms into an emotional prison. And the most tragic part is that many live for decades inside this prison without even knowing there is a door. This door exists, but it doesn't open with force. It opens with presence. Presence to look at what was ignored, to feel what was repressed, to listen to what was silenced, to finally meet that part of you that was left behind, not to drag it, but to integrate it. Emotional freedom doesn't happen when we forget the past. It happens when it stops controlling us. And this control is not always obvious. Sometimes the past manifests in patterns of self-sabotage. Other times in the repeated choice of relationships that reinforce old wounds. Sometimes it's in the fear of trying. Other times in the urgency to please. Sometimes it's in constant anger. Other times in total apathy. The past settles in like a lens, and everything you see becomes distorted by it. The big question is, how do you free yourself from something that lives inside you, but was not created by you? This is the invitation of this video, not to forget, but to understand. Not to erase, but to transform. Not to overcome, but to integrate. And finally, move on. Perhaps you have never stopped to listen to this part of you that still hurts. Perhaps it manifests in impulses, in blockages, in inexplicable fears. But what it wants most is not for you to ignore it, nor for you to conquer it. It wants to be recognized. It wants to be seen. Because what imprisons us is not the memory. It is the refusal to sit with it. Healing begins the moment you say, "Yes, this marked me. Yes, this hurt me, and now I am ready to look at it with new eyes. Eyes that do not judge, that do not demand an immediate answer, that do not need to solve everything, just to see." Seeing is the first act of freedom, and when you see, with compassion, with presence, with truth, something inside you begins to reorganize. The part of you that was frozen begins to thaw. The voice that was muffled begins to whisper. And that whisper, however small, is already a path back home. This video is about that. About how unfelt pain creates psychic prisons, and how the courage to feel can finally return you to yourself. What traps us in the past is not the event. It is the emotional impact that was not digested. It's important to understand this. It is not necessary to remember exactly what happened to feel the effects of what happened. trauma acts like an internal fissure, a wound that hasn't healed because it was never truly recognized. And the more we try to move forward without looking at it, the more it leads us down invisible paths. Gabor Maté states that trauma is not in the event, but in the inner disconnection it causes. It is this disconnection that prevents us from responding to the present with freedom. We live trapped by old triggers. We react with patterns that were once useful, but today sabotage us. For example, someone who learned in childhood that showing sadness resulted in punishment or abandonment may, in adult life, constantly repress their own suffering until that suffering explodes in anxiety crises, panic attacks, or deep apathy. And the worst part? This person doesn't always associate it with the past. They just feel that something is wrong, and they try to solve in the now what was born back then. This is the hidden problem. The old pain remains active, even if you don't remember it. It becomes a lens, an expectation, a distrust, a tension, and the body carries what the mind could not name. The philosophical roots of this phenomenon are linked to the dissociation of the soul that modernity promotes. We live fragmented, mind on one side, emotion on another, body on another. We are trained to respond quickly, to always produce, to get over everything. But we are taught little or nothing about how to integrate. Integration is not forgetting. It is including the pain as part of your story, not to suffer again, but to welcome what was denied. Because what is not welcomed is repeated. Sometimes in our relationships, other times in our symptoms. You might realize you are stuck in the past when you react with disproportionate intensity to small things, sabotage yourself when things finally start to go right, feel fear without a clear cause, seek approval from figures who remind you of old rejections, flee from deep connections to avoid reliving old abandonments. These patterns are not defects, they are requests to be heard. And when you start to listen, even with fear, something already begins to change. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to be willing to ask with sincerity, what in me is still living a story that has already passed? If this reflection is touching something in you, consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. There are others like it waiting for you, because perhaps what you call a blockage is, in fact, a part of you that is still waiting to be found. This reunion requires time, care, and above all, a new kind of listening. A listening that doesn't rush, that doesn't correct, that doesn't demand a logical explanation. Often, trauma doesn't speak in words, it speaks in sensations. It speaks in the tightness in your chest, in the persistent insomnia, in the inability to relax even when safe. It speaks in the repeated patterns you did not choose, but live. It speaks in the relationships that always seem to end the same way. And when you start to recognize these signals as emotional memories, and not as personal flaws, you begin to change the relationship you have with yourself. You stop blaming yourself, and you start listening to yourself. This listening is the root of emotional freedom, because freedom is not forgetting the past. It is preventing it from deciding your future. But this freedom is only born from radical acceptance. Something did happen, yes, and it had an effect, and it still lives in me. But now I choose to look at it with presence, not to relive but to recover, not to sink but to liberate myself. And from there, life begins to open new paths, not by magic, but because for the first time, you have stopped running from yourself. This reconnection with the past is not about becoming its prisoner. It is about becoming responsible for your own emotional narrative. Because as long as trauma is deciding for you, your choices will not be free. They will be disguised reactions. Freedom begins when you stop asking, why does this still affect me? And start asking, what is this still showing me? This change in question changes everything, because it shifts the focus from judgment to listening, from control to care, from repression to integration. And then, for the first time, the past begins to occupy its rightful place, that of memory and no longer of command. You will still feel, you will remember. It will hurt sometimes, but now you will be present. And presence transforms pain into a path, and this path is what can return you, not to who you were before the trauma, but to who you can be now, with everything you've learned, with everything you've survived, with everything that still pulses in you as truth. The consequences of living trapped in the past are not obvious at first glance. They don't appear with a clear warning. They emerge as repeating patterns, as persistent feelings that can't be explained, as a sense of disconnection that settles in even when everything seems fine. You can be working, relating, studying, exercising, and still feel that something inside you is frozen, as if there is an invisible layer between you and life, as if nothing truly gets through to you, or worse, as if everything gets through to you far too deeply. This happens because parts of you have become stuck in old emotional states, stuck in memories that were not integrated, in pains that were not legitimized, in silences that were not heard. The first invisible consequence is emotional disconnection. You begin to react more than you act. Instead of choosing, you repeat. Instead of feeling, you defend yourself. Life becomes a field of emotional surveillance, and no longer a space of presence. Another consequence is the collapse of emotional self-trust. You feel, but you don't know if you can trust what you feel. You constantly ask yourself if you are exaggerating, if you are being weak, if you should be fine. And the more you question, the less you listen to yourself. The inner voice becomes noise, not a guide. This generates psychic exhaustion, an exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from denying yourself all the time. This constant self-denial also manifests in the body that carries the tension of the contained soul. Chronic muscle tension, recurring aches, migraines, sleep disorders, lack of appetite or compulsions. The body tries to express what you could not name, and in response you often try to get better with techniques, tips, more productivity, more control. But this only reinforces the cycle, because what is needed is not improvement, it's listening. This listening includes recognizing that the past is still active, not as blame, but as fact. The third invisible consequence is the unconscious repetition of wounded bonds. You unknowingly seek out what once hurt you, sometimes trying to fix the past in the present, other times out of sheer familiarity with the pain, as if suffering were the only known place. And this repetition traps you in cycles. You change the scenery, but the script repeats. You change relationships, but you feel the same absence. You change jobs, but you feel the same emptiness, until you start to distrust yourself, and you lose your sense of worthiness, as if pain is the only thing you are allowed to experience. If you've ever felt something like this, and feel free to share. Sometimes the comments are the echo of many who feel alone. Save this video. Maybe you'll need to hear this again when you forget that the past can be integrated, not carried. But there is another, even more subtle consequence, the fear of the present. Because when the past still hurts, the present becomes a threat. Every possibility of happiness is accompanied by suspicion. Every approach generates anxiety. Every feeling of lightness is followed by guilt. It's as if something in you is saying, this won't last. This will hurt later. This is too good to be true. This constant fear sabotages spontaneity, lightness, love, surrender. And gradually you begin to protect yourself from life instead of living it. Emotional freedom starts to seem unattainable, not because you don't deserve it, but because you can't even imagine what it would be like to live without this weight. But the truth is, this weight is not you. It's just an old story that needs to be rewritten. And this rewriting doesn't begin with big changes. It begins with small permissions. To feel without correcting. To name without judging. To ask for help without guilt. To rest without justification. To cry without rushing. These permissions are internal revolutions because they break the cycle of silence. And when the silence is broken, the soul begins to return. Gradually, but with truth. And where there is truth, there is the possibility of healing. This healing is not a destination, it's a process. And in this process, every step of listening is a step of liberation. You begin to realize that you are not broken. You are in reconstruction. And this changes everything, because now the past is no longer a ghost, it's a story. And stories can be revisited, reframed, retold. The pain that once paralyzed you now teaches you. And the fear that once froze you now invites you to be careful. You don't need to solve everything today, but you can start with a sincere question. What in me needs to be heard, not corrected? This question opens up space. And space is all that trauma needs to stop being a prison and become a lesson. The true emotional rebellion doesn't begin when you conquer the past, but when you stop running from it. It begins the moment that, instead of ignoring your old pains, you choose to sit with them. Not to dramatize, not to suffer more, but to listen. To listen with a presence that perhaps never existed before. Because most of us carry old wounds waiting for one simple thing: to be heard. A listening without rush, without judgment, without an objective. This listening is an act of internal revolution. You don't need to understand everything. You don't need to solve everything. You just need to stop running. Because every time you run from yourself, you reinforce the pattern that imprisons you. This escape is what fuels the mechanisms of repetition. When you feel a discomfort and immediately distract yourself, when something hurts and you pretend it doesn't matter, when you feel sadness and immediately try to cheer up, you are feeding the very structure that trauma built. The rebellion is to break this cycle. It is to pause in the face of pain, to breathe in the face of discomfort, to say, I see you, to the part of you that has been hidden for so long, waiting for a glance. This glance is transformative. Because when you look with presence, the pain changes its form. It ceases to be a symptom and becomes a memory. And a memory, when welcomed, ceases to command. That is where emotional freedom begins. But it doesn't come ready-made. It comes in fragments. It comes in small gestures. On the day you allow yourself to cry without rushing. On the day you say no without guilt. On the day you feel fear. And yet, you hold space for yourself. These small gestures are symbolic rebellions. They break with centuries of denial. They give you back the right to exist wholly. And maybe you are now rediscovering this path. If this type of content is a welcoming space for you, consider becoming a member of the channel. For less than 8 Rs a month, you support this work and access exclusive reflections, created for those who have decided to break free from the inside out. This decision, to feel, is one of the most revolutionary, because feeling requires presence. And presence is everything the trauma could not have. When you are present with your pain, you reframe it, not as something that needs to disappear, but as something that can be integrated. And this integration transforms everything. You begin to realize that your emotions are not obstacles, they are messengers. And when you stop correcting them, They begin to guide. Anger shows where there is a boundary, sadness where there was a loss, fear where there is something precious. The body where there is truth. You begin to trust your feelings, and this changes your relationship with yourself. And gradually, you become free. Not like one who escapes, but like one who returns. Returns to the body, returns to the emotion, returns to the now. This is the rebellion, to exit the cycle of correction and enter the cycle of listening. It is to stop trying to fit into what is expected of you, and to start sustaining who you really are. And this sustaining is not rigid. It is alive. It is dynamic. It is human. You begin to hold space for yourself even when you fail, even when you repeat the pattern, even when it hurts. And you realize that this, in itself, is already healing. Because there is no healing without welcome. And the more you welcome yourself, the less you abandon yourself. The less you abandon yourself, the less you repeat the past. And the less you repeat, the more space there is to create something new, something of your own. And this newness begins slowly. Sometimes it's just a different thought, a softer response, a respected silence, a boundary set, a gesture of kindness toward your own body. These signs are small revolutions, signs that the past no longer has as much power, signs that, even if it still hurts, you are choosing differently. And choosing differently is always the beginning of freedom. The rebellion in the end is this: to stop repeating and to start creating. Creating new bonds, new responses, new paths, a new way of being in the world, without the armor of control, without the weight of guilt, without the fear of feeling. You learn to say, "This happened, yes, but I am no longer that person. And now, I choose to hold myself, not to punish myself." This choice changes everything, and maybe in this exact moment you are feeling it. A lightness that comes not from escape, but from truth. A truth that for the first time doesn't hurt, because it was heard. And then you realize, the pain was never the problem. The problem was the silence, the constant attempt to quiet what needed to be heard. When you stop fighting what you feel, something changes. The pain doesn't disappear, but it softens. It transforms. It communicates. And gradually it reveals something you may have never considered. It was trying to protect you. This perception is the beginning of the transformation. Because behind all pain, there is an attempt at care, at survival, at keeping you safe. Even the patterns that sabotage you today were born as protection. They were intelligent responses to a difficult environment, but now you can thank them and choose differently. This choice does not come from effort. It comes from presence. Presence to recognize that you are no longer that child. That now there are more resources, more consciousness, more inner space. And when you recognize this, something in you relaxes. Some of the constant vigilance dissolves. And you begin to experience a new way of being in the world, without defending yourself all the time. This freedom is subtle. It is not about never feeling pain again. It is about no longer needing to run from it. It is about knowing that when it comes, you will no longer be alone, because now you are with you. This is the most powerful realization, the restored presence. You are there, inside yourself, with all that you feel, with all that you are, without denying, without correcting, without molding, and that is enough. This presence changes the quality of your existence, because now you are no longer a hostage to what happened. You continue to remember, you continue to feel, but from another place. From a place where there is ground, where there is a base, where there is listening. You no longer need immediate answers. nor promises of constant happiness, because now you have something more valuable, a real relationship with what you feel. This relationship allows you to cry without guilt, to laugh without fear, to say "I don't know" without shame, to be whole even on days when everything seems fragmented. And this is emotional freedom, a freedom not measured in achievements, but in intimacy with oneself. A freedom not translated into euphoria, but into truth. This truth returns you to life, to a life that is less idealized but more inhabitable, less performative, more felt. And then you understand, the past no longer needs to command. It can just accompany you, like a story you carry with dignity, like a scar that reminds you of your strength, like a chapter that taught you, but no longer defines you. This change is invisible to the world, but inside you, it is everything. You stop looking outside for what could only be born from within. You stop running, you stop proving yourself, and you begin to inhabit yourself. You begin to care for yourself with the same affection you once expected from others. And you realize that what was once neediness has now become presence. This is the rarest healing, the kind that does not erase the past, but transforms it into fertile ground. You begin to live with more lightness, not because everything is perfect, but because you have stopped carrying the weight of what is past, as if it were still the present. And that, in itself, is an intimate miracle. You no longer need to run to not feel, nor numb yourself to endure. You have learned to listen, and this listening is your anchor. It keeps you in yourself, even on difficult days, even when everything outside seems to be collapsing. Because now you know, the safest place in the world can be you when you are present. And this presence is what transforms pain into a path. You didn't need to forget anything, nor forgive before it was time, nor force yourself to be well. You just decided not to run anymore. And that decision, as silent as it may seem, is a cry of freedom. You are here, whole, human, true, and for that very reason, free. There are other reflections like this waiting for you,